Sometimes a moment doesn't just pass by, it stops you. Not as background noise, not as something you scrolled past, but as something that presses against your attention and won't let go. When that happens, it's time to slow down, to listen closely. There's a difference between content you consume and moments that confront you. Most things flow through your mind without leaving a mark. They entertain, distract, or briefly stir you. But once in a while, something doesn't flow through. It sticks. It creates a pause. That pause is not an accident. You might try to explain it away. Call it timing, call it the algorithm, blame your mood or the quiet of the room. That's what we do when truth gets too close. But underneath, you know when something lands differently. You feel it as a slight tightening in your chest, a quiet unease, a sense that you were meant to encounter this now, not later. That feeling isn't mystical. It's your inner alarm, a psychological and moral signal that activates when avoidance has gone on too long. Meaningful interruptions rarely arrive when everything is comfortable. They arrive when something inside you is straining under the weight of delay. When you've been negotiating with yourself, making excuses, telling yourself you'll deal with it later. When things calm down, when you're more ready, when the timing feels right. But life doesn't wait for you to feel ready. And the longer responsibility is deferred, the heavier it becomes. Pay attention to this. True urgency doesn't feel like panic. Panic scatters you, urgency focuses you. It sharpens your awareness and narrows your attention to what actually matters. If you feel a quiet pressure to keep listening, it's because something in your life has reached a point where delay is no longer neutral. Each day you wait compounds the cost of inaction. That's how people wake up years later wondering how things fell apart so slowly, so completely. Most lives aren't ruined in dramatic moments. They're eroded through small, daily acts of avoidance, ignoring necessary conversations, tolerating situations that feel wrong, abandoning disciplines they once valued, quieting their own conscience because listening would require change. Eventually, that silence becomes its own kind of noise. When something breaks through, it can feel intrusive, but that intrusion is the point. If this has reached you, it's likely because whatever you've been postponing has begun to demand recognition. Truth doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it interrupts. Sometimes it corners you. Sometimes it makes you stop pretending you don't already know what needs to be done. That internal recognition, the sense that this isn't random, isn't a message from outside. It's something within you aligning with something real. You don't need full understanding to begin. Understanding often follows action. The mind resists because it senses the weight that comes with clarity. But clarity isn't the enemy. Delay is. And the longer delay continues, the louder the consequences become. What starts as a whisper eventually turns into anxiety, frustration, and disarray. So if you felt the impulse to stay with this, to listen closely instead of turning away, respect that impulse. Not because it flatters you, but because it challenges you. This isn't about comfort. It's about orientation, about whether you move toward what requires courage or retreat into distraction. Something has been placed in front of you at the precise moment when ignoring it would cost more than facing it. That fact alone should tell you this moment matters more than you may want to admit. When something appears at the right time, when meaningful insight surfaces at a precise moment in your life, it's easy to either romanticize it or dismiss it. People often swing between seeing signs everywhere and seeing nothing at all. Both miss what's essential. What matters isn't how it appeared, but why it captured your attention. Attention isn't random. It's guided by relevance, by unresolved tension within. You notice what connects to something unfinished inside you. When an idea keeps returning in different forms through different paths, that isn't coincidence. It's your psyche signaling that something essential has been neglected. We are remarkably skilled at avoidance. We can distract, rationalize, and delay almost endlessly. But meaning has a way of breaking through when avoidance begins to threaten our stability. That's when thoughts sharpen, when certain words feel weighted, when a message seems to speak directly to a problem you haven't named. Truth rarely arrives as something brand new. More often, it arrives as something familiar you've been circling for a long time. The conversation you keep rehearsing in your mind, the decision you keep putting off, the boundary you know should exist but doesn't. When something appears at the right time, it's often because the cost of staying the same has quietly surpassed the cost of change. Your mind recognizes this before you consciously put it into words. People like to believe clarity comes first and action follows. In reality, it's often the reverse. Action demands courage, courage demands responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. So the mind sometimes resists clarity to avoid that weight, but resistance has limits. When those limits are reached, clarity presses forward, not as comfort, but as sobering pressure. Pay attention to how this feels. It doesn't feel exciting in a superficial way. It feels grounding, slightly uncomfortable, serious. That seriousness emerges when meaning is involved. Meaning is what organizes life across time. It gives structure to sacrifice and direction to difficulty. When something meaningful appears, it's often because disorder is growing where it shouldn't be. That's why such moments frequently arrive during periods of quiet tension, not necessarily in crisis, but in that uneasy middle ground where things aren't falling apart yet, but they will if nothing changes. Your awareness is predictive. It senses trajectories. It knows when a pattern, if continued, leads to loss. And before the loss becomes visible, the warning appears as attention. What you're experiencing isn't a command or a promise. It's an invitation to acknowledge what you already know but have been unwilling to face. The fact that this moment stands out against the noise is evidence of its relevance. Your attention has been captured because something in you recognizes the truth here as applicable, not abstract. And that recognition brings responsibility, not guilt, but the ability to respond. Once something becomes clear, neutrality duality disappears. There's no returning to not knowing. From here, there is only alignment or resistance. When something appears at the right time, it's because time itself has become a factor. Delay is no longer harmless. The crossroads isn't ahead, you're already standing in its shadow. What happens next doesn't depend on whether you believe in signs, but on whether you respect the signal your own conscience is sending. Why this can't wait urgency is often misunderstood. It's not panic, pressure, or melodrama. Real urgency doesn't shout, it focuses. It clarifies what matters and quietly removes your excuses. When something feels urgent in this deeper sense, it's not because disaster is striking. It's because a trajectory has been set, and continuing on it will lead somewhere you don't want to go. Urgency appears when time becomes a factor, when the space for error starts to shrink. Life presents windows that close quietly without fanfare. Conversations that could have been honest become impossible. Situations that could have been resolved cleanly grow tangled. Small compromises become permanent conditions. And by the time the damage is obvious, your freedom to act is often narrowed. That's why urgency often arrives before things look bad enough to justify change. There's a reason you feel the nudge to listen now instead of later. Later isn't neutral. Waiting feels safe because it postpones discomfort, but it quietly accumulates consequences. Each delay reinforces the pattern you're in. Each avoided decision strengthens the habit of avoidance. Over time, that habit becomes character, and character becomes destiny. Urgency is your mind's way of interrupting that process before it hardens. We often assume we'll recognize the critical moment when it comes. In reality, critical moments rarely announce themselves. They look ordinary, a recurring thought, a mild dissatisfaction, a sense that something is slightly off. The danger isn't that you don't know what to do. The danger is convincing yourself you have time. Most irreversible damage happens under the illusion that there will be another chance. This is why urgency carries moral weight. It's not about speed, it's about responsibility. When you sense something needs addressing now, it's because ignoring it makes you complicit in the outcome. Silence becomes agreement. Inaction becomes a decision. There's a physical dimension, too. The body holds unresolved responsibility as tension. The mind responds with rumination. Anxiety often springs not from imagined threats, but from real obligations we've postponed. Urgency doesn't mean you must act recklessly. It means you must stop pretending nothing is at stake. It calls you out of passivity and back into agency. The reason this feels time-sensitive isn't because something external is about to happen to you. It's because something internal is about to solidify. Every day you delay, the range of possible futures narrows. Options close not because the world is cruel, but because time rewards commitment and punishes indecision. The earlier you act, the more graceful the adjustment can be. The longer you wait, the sharper the correction becomes. Urgency is mercy in disguise. It appears before the lesson turns catastrophic. So when you feel that quiet insistence to pay attention now, understand it isn't trying to frighten you. It's trying to orient you. This moment matters more than you think, not because it's dramatic, but because it's formative. What you choose or refuse to choose here is already shaping what comes next. Why this found you the idea of being chosen can be misleading. It's not about special status or destiny. It's about capacity. Responsibility doesn't fall evenly because not everyone is equally prepared to carry it. The fact that this message reached you isn't a compliment. It's an assignment. Many people encounter similar truths and brush past them. They feel a flicker of discomfort and return to distraction, humor, or cynicism. That isn't because they're inferior. It's because they're overloaded, unwilling, or not yet ready to face what truth would ask of them. To truly hear something meaningful requires a certain strength, the ability to sit with discomfort without immediately numbing it. Being chosen in this sense means you can withstand that tension. You can hold the space between who you are and who you know you could be without collapsing into denial or self-judgment. That capacity is rare, not because people lack intelligence, but because many lack the willingness to exchange short-term comfort for long-term integrity. There's also a sobering side to this. Those who can bear weight are often given more of it earlier. They're confronted with responsibility before they feel ready. They grow through pressure, not ease. That's why clarity can feel lonely. Once you see, you can't unsee. Once you recognize your role in your own struggles, blaming the world becomes harder. That clarity separates you not from others, but from your former excuses. You weren't chosen because you're perfect. You were chosen because you're unfinished and aware of it. Awareness is the prerequisite for change. Without it, people remain in cycles they can't name. With it, they're called to act. That call is heavy. Many spend their lives avoiding it. If you're still listening, it's because some part of you is no longer willing to run. Life tests us incrementally. If you handle pressure without growing bitter, more responsibility follows. If you can speak truth without crumbling, more truth is asked of you. This isn't cruelty, it's calibration. Strength grows in proportion to the weight it carries, and meaning emerges where responsibility is willingly accepted. That's why the call doesn't reach everyone equally. Not everyone is in a position to respond. Some are overwhelmed. Some are deeply invested in illusions. Some haven't yet felt the consequences of avoidance strongly enough to awaken. You, however, are at a point where awareness has become unavoidable. That's the mark of selection, not privilege, but readiness. Being chosen also means being accountable. Once you recognize you're capable of more, pretending otherwise becomes a kind of dishonesty. You can no longer hide behind helplessness or ignorance. This is where many stumble. They want the identity of being aware without the burden of acting. But awareness without action corrodes the spirit. It turns insight into self-contempt. So if this feels personal, it's because it meets you at your level level of capacity. You're being addressed not as someone who needs saving, but as someone who can respond. That distinction matters. You're not being carried, you're being asked to stand. And that invitation carries an expectation that you'll move toward responsibility even when no one is watching and no applause follows. What happens if you look away when responsibility is avoided? Consequences rarely appear all at once. They gather beneath the surface quietly. Life may still look functional from the outside. That's why ignoring what you know feels deceptively safe at first. No alarms sound, nothing collapses. But avoidance isn't neutral. It's active. It shapes reality over time. What's left unaddressed begins to transform. A truth that could have been spoken cleanly becomes tension. A boundary that could have been set calmly becomes resentment. A decision that could have been made freely becomes an obligation. The longer something is ignored, the less voluntary your response becomes. Eventually, life forces the issue, but by then, the terms are no longer in your favor. Psychologically, ignored responsibility doesn't vanish. It sinks into the unconscious and resurfaces as anxiety, irritability, a chronic low-grade dissatisfaction. You feel restless without knowing why. You lose patience quickly. You grow cynical not because the world has worsened, but because your internal alignment has weakened. The mind keeps accounts, even when you refuse to look at the ledger. There's also a slow erosion of integrity each time you choose comfort over truth. The next compromise becomes easier to justify. Small concessions stack up. What once would have troubled your conscience becomes normal. This is how people drift from their values without ever consciously deciding to abandon them. Character isn't destroyed in one act. It's diluted through repeated avoidance. Over time, this erosion shows. Relationships strain under unspoken truths. Opportunities fade because indecision signals unreliability. Self-respect weakens because somewhere inside, you know you're capable of more. This internal fracture is often mistaken for bad luck, burnout, or oppression, when in truth, it's the delayed toll of unclaimed responsibility. What makes this especially dangerous is that the cost of correction grows with time. The longer you wait, the more tangled things become. Others adapt to your silence. Systems form around your inaction. Roles solidify. By the time you decide to move, your options are fewer and the resistance is stronger. That's why people often say, "I wish I had done this earlier." Earlier was cleaner. Earlier required less sacrifice. Ignoring what you know also trains you to distrust yourself. Each time you override your conscience, you weaken the inner signal that guides you. Over time, that signal grows faint. You feel lost, not because guidance is unavailable, but because you've taught yourself not to listen. This is one of the most painful costs, the loss of your own inner authority. Without it, people turn to external validation, trends, and approval to make decisions, a poor substitute for true direction. Eventually, reality intervenes. What you refuse to confront willingly will confront you unwillingly, not as punishment but as necessity. Truth surfaces. Chaos expands where order was neglected. And when the lesson finally arrives through difficulty, it's harsher, not because life is cruel, but because it was delayed. The tragedy is that much of this is preventable, not by perfection, but by timely action, by small, honest steps taken early, by listening when the message is still quiet. Once it becomes loud, the cost has already multiplied. What to do now, right now? You're not being asked for complete understanding or a perfectly mapped future. That expectation can become another excuse for delay. Clarity rarely arrives all at once. Waiting for it is often a way of avoiding movement. What's needed is more precise and more challenging. You're being asked to take responsibility for the next step you already know you should take. Not the whole staircase, just the next step that's been quietly insisting on your attention. Action at this level is rarely dramatic. It doesn't come with certainty or applause. It usually comes with discomfort, hesitation, and the fear of disruption. You feel it when you consider telling the truth instead of keeping peace. When you think about setting a boundary that might unsettle someone who benefits from your silence. When you imagine leaving a situation that's familiar but corrosive. These moments reveal the cost of meaning, because meaning always demands something in return. The mistake is believing meaningful action requires confidence beforehand. In reality, confidence often follows action. It doesn't precede it. Waiting to feel ready keeps you circling in self-doubt. Acting in alignment with what you know, even while uncertain, is what rebuilds self-respect. And self-respect isn't built through positive affirmations. It's built through behavior that proves you can trust yourself. What you're being called to do is likely simple to name and difficult to do. It might be a conversation you've rehearsed but never started. It might be the decision to stop participating in something that drains your integrity. It might be the first step of a discipline you keep postponing because it highlights your inconsistencies. The simplicity of the step doesn't lessen its significance. Small actions taken at the right time alter trajectories. There's a principle here: order precedes expansion. Before life opens outward, it demands internal alignment. That alignment begins when you stop lying, especially to yourself. Truth doesn't require cruelty or drama. It requires precision. Say what is accurate. Do what is necessary. Remove what is clearly harmful. These acts restore structure, and structure creates the stability growth requires. You might be tempted to negotiate, to act halfway while preserving your comfort, to soften the truth so it costs you less. But half measures prolong the struggle. They give the illusion of progress without the substance of change. Real movement happens when you accept that some discomfort isn't a sign you're wrong. It's a sign you're on track. The resistance you feel is often proportional to the importance of the action. Discipline plays a quiet role here, not as punishment but as commitment. Doing what you said you would do, especially especially when no one is watching, showing up consistently even when motivation fades. These small acts of order compound over time, gradually reducing chaos. They rebuild trust between you and your future self, and that trust becomes a source of strength when larger challenges arise. The goal isn't to transform your entire life overnight. That fantasy leads to paralysis. The goal is to interrupt the pattern of avoidance. One honest conversation, one firm boundary, one deliberate choice not to continue what you know is wrong. These actions signal a shift from being acted upon by circumstances to acting within them. What you're doing now is choosing orientation over outcome. You can't control how others respond. You can't guarantee immediate relief, but you can choose to align with what you know to be true. That alignment is stabilizing, even when it's uncomfortable. It reduces internal conflict and restores a sense of agency that no external reassurance can match. This moment is asking you to stop waiting for permission, certainty, or rescue. You already have enough information to act. What remains is the willingness to accept the cost. And once that cost is paid, something subtle but profound begins to change. Your life starts to feel less like something that happens to you and more like something you are shaping, consciously, responsibly, one step at a time. If you're still here, if you're still reading, still allowing this to unfold instead of turning away, that alone matters more than you may realize. Not because it flatters you, but because it reveals something about your orientation. Most people look away the moment a message begins to demand responsibility. They distract, minimize, convince themselves it doesn't apply. Staying present means you're at least willing to face what might be required, even if you don't yet know how far that responsibility extends. What's happening now isn't dramatic on the surface, but it's decisive underneath. Alignment rarely announces itself with noise. It feels quieter than impulse, steadier than emotion. It feels like recognition, like something inside settling into place. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. When truth aligns with conscience, resistance weakens. Not because fear disappears, but because avoidance becomes harder to justify. People often imagine guidance as commands or guarantees. In reality, it often comes as increasing clarity about what no longer works. You begin to see your own patterns with uncomfortable accuracy. You notice where you've been dishonest, not necessarily in words, but in behavior. You see where you've tolerated what diminishes you, excused what you'd never advise someone else to accept. That awareness isn't meant to condemn you. It's meant to position you. What some call fate or intervention can be understood more plainly as the convergence of truth and timing. When the gap between who you are and who you could be grows too wide, something intervenes, not to save you from effort, but to remove your excuses. You're not being pushed forward by force. You're being cornered by clarity. And clarity is relentless once it arrives. That's why ignoring moments like this carries such a cost. It's not about punishment, it's about division. Knowing what to do and refusing to do it fractures the self. That fracture expresses itself as anxiety, bitterness, and a vague sense that life is slipping sideways instead of moving forward. The longer the division lasts, the harder it becomes to recover your direction. There's also something sobering to remember. Messages like this don't repeat forever. Not because truth disappears, but because attention can. People slowly train themselves not to listen. They override their conscience so many times its voice fades into background noise. When that happens, life stops feeling meaningful and starts feeling mechanical. Days blur. Choices feel arbitrary. That isn't freedom, it's disorientation. Right now, you're still oriented. You still feel the tension between comfort and meaning. That tension is painful, but it's also a sign of health. It means you haven't numbed yourself into indifference. It means you can still be called forward, not just pushed by circumstance. That capacity is precious and fragile. What happens next depends on whether you treat this moment as information or as instruction. Information can be acknowledged and ignored. Instruction demands a response. No one else can make that choice for you. No external authority will arrive to enforce it. Responsibility, by its nature, is voluntary. That's what gives it dignity and weight. If you listen now, while the message is still clear and internal, the adjustment can be subtle. A shift in behavior, a refusal to continue a lie, a step toward order instead of chaos. But if you wait until life teaches the same lesson through loss, rupture, or regret, the cost will be higher and the pain sharper. That isn't a threat. It's an observation, one repeated endlessly in human experience. So take this seriously. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but soberly. Let it orient you. Let it sharpen your awareness of what you already know needs to change. Truth doesn't beg and it doesn't chase. It presents itself, waits briefly, and then allows consequences to take over. You're still in the phase where listening is enough to change the outcome. Later, listening may no longer be an option. Only endurance will remain. This is here now not because you're favored, but because you're responsible. And responsibility, once recognized, doesn't loosen its grip until it's carried.